Hello and welcome to COM 404, Principles of Persuasion. In this brief video I'd like to talk about one of the outcomes of persuasion that we all hope to achieve, which is otherwise changing people's attitudes, behaviors, or otherwise influencing them to make decisions. One of the things we'll talk about today is inoculation theory, and how inoculation theory is often used to plant a seed in the audience or receiver's minds in ways that might otherwise lead them to think differently in future instances. We'll call this a preemptive argument, and today inoculation theory will be one of the preeminent ways that we describe how arguers, including marketers and otherwise politicians, use various different techniques of argument and persuasion to embed messages in their receivers' or audience's minds to better prepare them for the messages they might receive in the future. Before we jump into inoculation theory, I think it's important we first talk a little bit about how folks who study persuasion, like myself, even study the ways that we might change attitudes, behaviors, or otherwise influence people to make decisions in the future. One of the ways that I'll describe how politicians and others make arguments that create social change is to describe social norm campaigns. Social norm campaigns are a distinct form of campaign that you might choose to describe or write about in your upcoming fact campaign presentation paper. Finally, in the third part of today's lecture, we'll transition to describing inoculation theory, and we'll look at how we might understand its theoretical assumptions, some of the worldviews it espouses, and also identifying some of the practical explanations and principles for guidelines and future behavior change that we can identify that come from inoculation theory. If you think about something like a commercial and the way that it's designed to persuade you, the ultimate end goal of any commercial is to get you to purchase that object. So the question of whether or not you've purchased it would be one way we might measure whether that commercial was successful. However, it's very difficult for marketers to follow individuals around the store and be able to determine whether or not commercials were the reason they purchased a particular candy bar or other item. And so as scholars who study argumentation and persuasion, we're tasked with a difficult challenge. How do we study and measure persuasion and the influences it has on various attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs? Well, one of the ways we do that is by focusing very specifically on attitudes in things like experimental settings, following people's behaviors and observing various trends over time through aggregated and collective data. However, it's very difficult to measure the gold standard of behavior because that endpoint of persuasive change often happens far away from the laboratory or the place of research being conducted. So because participants aren't necessarily present at the time of action, often behavior can be difficult. And so instead of measuring behavior specifically or directly, scientists and scholars of argumentation often focus on analyzing self-reports of behavior. When we talk about self-reports of behavior, we're talking about things like surveys and otherwise interviews which might help determine how individuals feel about various different objects, items, behaviors, beliefs, or things that we might try to lead individuals into changing or persuading themselves on. So as a result, researchers, coming up with ways to handle this challenge and frustration, have identified a number of proxies or alternative measurements for understanding behavioral change. Think about a politician, for example. A politician spends their entire campaign not knowing whether or not you'll actually pull the lever for them or actually vote for them. And so the task for them instead is to change your attitudes towards that politician, making them think they're more of a family person or more likely to be electable in regards to your workplace environment. And by creating certain social, environmental, and otherwise familial connections, all of those narratives they build up help lead you to be able to change your attitude or to influence your behavior to vote for an individual. Similar at the grocery store. We often choose to make those decisions, as we've described, through that peripheral route. The end point of persuasion is typically based on attitudes and behaviors we may not even know consciously that we have as we operate through heuristic clues and shortcuts in that peripheral mode. And so, challenged with this peripheral mode, we often, as scientists trying to adopt a way to understand and analyze argument, think about things like looking at audience research, marketing data, or even producing our own original data through various forms of surveys and using audiences' self-reported responses. If we think about methods of measuring behavior, one of the ways that scientists and other individuals seeking to study argument might measure behavioral change over time is to look at what's called aggregated behavior. Aggregated behavior takes into account a range of beliefs over time that are used to inform decision making. Think back to that previous theory we described of the narrative paradigm, and recall how those stories embedded in our life's history help build up our experiences in ways that lead to coherence and fidelity. That coherence and fidelity helps aggregate the behavioral decisions we make over time. And so scientists might examine these behavioral decisions over time more longitudinally. They might also seek to propose other methods that can be more reliable for ways that we might understand the way individuals engage in behaviors or attitudes. One of the other methods they might use is asking individuals their behavioral intention or their expressed willingness. We'll often on surveys see questions like, after watching this commercial, how likely would you be to do X? Well, those how likely would you be are trying to determine whether or not your attitude has sufficiently shifted to predict whether your behavior will change in the future. If your attitude towards a particular brand has shifted along that perhaps latitude of acceptance described by the social judgment theory, if we can sufficiently move you along that latitude of acceptance, then presumably you'll have more brand affinity or more likelihood to buy from that brand because you like that brand than you did in the previous instance. A lot of commercials are about that. Perhaps you're familiar with the most recent Google Loretta commercial. Certainly that seeks to build a brand affinity as much as it might also sell the product that it advertises. However, we should note, studying and examining expressed interest or otherwise behavioral intention and willingness can be very difficult because behavioral willingness is oftentimes a result of cognitive and rational decision making. But we've already described when talking about elaboration likelihood modeling that not all decisions are made cognitively or rationally. And so for those peripheral choices, thinking through some sort of effort to express behavioral willingness might be more difficult for some individuals in surveys or otherwise in interview formats. They might not know they have certain beliefs, or the beliefs they have, they might not be comfortable sharing. Communication scholars and those who study argument have found that people are more likely to be attentive to arguments or more likely to get involved in an issue discussion if they have motivation and opportunities that might lead to decisions that affect their lives and consequences. Put simply, what scientists have called the mode model suggests that people are more likely to make deliberative judgments if they are highly involved in the subject area of interest, if they're motivated to do more because it risks or is related to issues that concern their lives, and if there is some sort of profit potential or fun that makes it relevant and interesting to their lives and experiences. When people don't have as much relevance or motivation, or perhaps they just don't know as much about the topic, then they're less likely to engage in deliberative decisions and more likely to engage in spontaneous decisions, and that's where, as we return back to elaboration likelihood modeling, we might use a peripheral instead of a central route.